Lauren, in this assignment, I love it when students use animals as their main characters. I just think it's so cute, and I love this. I just love this. Really, really fantastic little story here. It's got so much potential. I don't think we're quite where we need to be yet. Number one, I think you've got, let me see, you've got only got 8 frames. I think 10 to 12 is optimal. Any less than 10, and I think the narrative has potential of not being clear. And I think any more than 12, I almost start running the risk of losing the audience. So I think 12, 13 frames or so would be perfect. Right now you have 8. I think we're a little bit short here. So let me describe this. And also, I want you to go through as many of these other videos as you can in this critique form, because for sure you're going to pick up things that will be applicable to yours. But basically, I'm kind of approaching this the same for all of these critiques, in that I want you to really think about a complete narrative and making sure there's no holes in the narrative and no assumptions that are being made that could cause confusion to the viewer. So let me go through this and let me describe what I think would help. All right. So first we got the mouse, and the mouse is sitting here, but I think we should somehow introduce a setting. Okay. So maybe the first frame could be in an apartment, and maybe the mouse is running across the apartment, or I don't know, maybe just somehow introduce the fact that the mouse is in somebody's apartment or in somebody's house. And you just think about what I'm not saying you have to do this. Just think about this and how it will be applicable to an expeditious narrative, right? So we introduce the setting. So instead of just saying, okay, here's the mouse and he's hungry, we say, okay, here's the mouse, he's in somebody's apartment where he lives. So maybe you could have them in, maybe show, gosh, I don't know how we're going to do this. I don't know. Think about it. So because we want to say maybe you could have him running across the kitchen, and we see that mouse trap and he's avoiding it. He goes in his little hole. You know how they have, sometimes you see in cartoons, you got the kitchen setting, then there's that little hole, like that little semicircle over the corner, that's a mouse hole. We used to see a lot of cartoons, right? So maybe he runs in, maybe he runs around the mouse trap and over into his hole, right? Then we show him in his hole, safe but hungry. And then this would make sense then, because at this frame we would have already introduced the cheese in the mousetrap by in that opening scene where he's just running across the kitchen floor to get to his hole, and he passes a mousetrap with the cheese in it, right? So that way the cheese isn't just kind of like, okay, I'm a mouse and I'm hungry for cheese, and there's just happens to appear a mousetrap with cheese in it. So we're introducing the cheese as part of the setting, the mousetrap as part of the setting. Does that make sense? Okay, then how does he get from his mouse hole up to this shelf? That's the thing that I'm wondering. So we really want to try to figure out and fill in some of these gaps. So once we figure out that how he gets from the mousetrap to the hole, maybe he could start thinking, okay, so the next frame here is he's thinking of that mousetrap, right? So that way you could go from the opening scene with the kitchen to him in his mouse hole, thinking about food, thinking about the cheese, and then transitioning to how I know that's again the biggest problem to me is how are we going to transition from him thinking about the cheese to him. So in the frame where he's in his hole, maybe we could have him thinking, he's scratching his belly, right? And maybe we could have him thinking about the mouse trap with the cheese in it instead of just the cheese. That way we're indicating to the audience that he has to get to a position to get the cheese, all right? Then at that point, you can go back to the kitchen. Now, in the kitchen, I would say the opening scene with the kitchen where he's running across the floor to get to his home, you could show the mousetrap on the floor and this shelf above it with the soup. That way, when we jump back to here, we know that he's on, you've already introduced the setting, right? So we know that he's on the shelf that's above the mousetrap in the kitchen, right? So at that point, we say to him, we got question marks, we got x plus b equals cheese. And that's interesting, but don't forget we're not allowed to use any words. I think question marks are okay, but x and b, letters and words we're not allowed to use, right? So try to figure out how to represent the fact that he wants to get the cheese, all right? Then we have the light bulb, and then we have him, and now he just all of a sudden grabs the floss. again, right in between here. Light bulb, I would have him back to the original scene with the kitchen where he's running the other direction, presumably into a hallway, right? Then you can show him with the floss. So now we know that he ran into another room to get the floss. Now we show him with the floss, starting to pull the floss. Then he's rappelling down to get the cheese, right? At that point, we can have him coming back up to the shelf and then go back to this frame where he's in his hole and enjoying the cheese, right? Okay, does that make sense? Now that's going to entail more frames, but again, try to think about how you can combine frames in a way that you don't want to end up with more than 12, 13, maybe 14 frames at the most. Otherwise, it's just going to be too dilute, and I think we could run the risk of losing viewers. Okay, so hopefully my comments make sense. Let me know if they don't. They'll definitely try to clarify, but I think there's some holes here that we need to address. Okay, at that point, I would recommend not placing these in individual squares. And the reason being is because we want to give this more of an open relationship, more of a symbiotic relationship where each frame is associated and related to each other in a way that doesn't isolate and create separation from the main composition. So instead of creating this kind of modular grid where each frame of the dialogue is in the grid, so we break these out of the grid and give them a more organic relationship with the composition, the picture plane, so to speak. And here's a great example of how we do that. Okay, so we've got this kind of organic flow. These are still confined in different frames, but they're circular frames and they're more of they're not so modular. You see what I'm saying? And this one is completely broken out of the frames. I love this. And each of the events is connected by the flight of the hornet. Okay, so what I would recommend at that point, once you figure out your narrative, then we want to figure out a way to connect these little frames with something that's going to create interest and something that's going to create interest. So an idea would be maybe the floss, maybe in yours the floss is connecting the frames, or maybe it's little mouse tracks connecting each one. So these would be little mouse tracks, right? Or the point is to try to find something really super interesting to connect the narrative components. Okay, so I know I threw a lot at you, Lauren, but let me know if you have any questions, because I think the main thing here is just to create the narrative in such of a manner that each frame is related to the frame before it and the frame after it, as well as related to the entire narrative. And I think that will create a degree of clarity that would preclude us the possibility of losing the viewer somewhere by some sort of confusion somewhere in midstream in the narrative. Make sense? Please let me know if it does make sense, because if it doesn't, I'd love to clarify, because I think you got some good stuff going on here, and I'm looking forward to watching this come to fruition. So great job, Lauren. If you have any questions at all, please let me know. Thank you very much.